I'm Meredith Preston McGhie. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. It's so great to be in conversation with you today, Henry. The Global Center for Pluralism is a fairly young institution founded by His Highness the Aga Khan and the Government of Canada as a joint initiative to advance pluralism around the world. So a huge job to try and influence and inform policymakers and societies more widely to hopefully spark greater understanding, commitment, and action around pluralism.
Excellent. Well, my name's Henry Kim. I'm director and CEO of the Aga Khan Museum. We're an art museum that opened up in 2014, founded by His Highness the Aga Khan. And our mission is to promote the arts and culture of the Muslim world, but more importantly, to look at how it connects and historically and even in the present day to the cultures that adjoin it and other cultures throughout the world. And so we really are concerned with connections among cultures, among Muslims within the Muslim world, but especially outside of it. And we are part of the AKDN. We're part of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, which promotes art and culture in the developing world through historic cities programs that help preserve monuments and shrines, through a music initiative that now has a music award, through the Award for Architecture, which is well over 30 years old, and through many other programs that look at the arts and culture throughout the Muslim world and protect, preserve, record it, and also spark discussion and debate. We're the art museum within this group, and we're very proud to be part of it.
I think, Henry, your comment just now on connection and dialogue is really also where a lot of the ideas and the work between our institutions intersect. Really importantly, the idea of bringing cultures together, of looking at the different commonalities as well as the beautiful diversity, not just across the Muslim world, but between Muslim civilizations and others. And something that I think we really value at the center is being connected to the wider AKDN, particularly around issues of arts and culture, which are so incredibly important in terms of pluralism and in terms of how you begin to understand and represent difference in your own society. Correct.
And I think that, you look at the arts and culture, and it's one of the areas that's probably more accessible than any other for people who are trying to explore what pluralism truly means. I think that everyone is part of a culture, if not multiple cultures. And it's just through that experience alone that you can start appreciating the fact that there are different viewpoints, different perspectives, different foods that people eat, different music that people are entertained by. And what's amazing is that through the arts and culture, you can actually explore, you can question, you can learn more. And I think that's one of the vital roles that we have as a museum in supporting pluralism, showcasing and also discussing what these differences and similarities truly are. The one thing that we know is that when you look at commonalities, when you look at what binds people together, it can be in the most subtle of ways, it can be in the most unexpected of ways. It could be through tabla music, it could be through food. And that's the amazing thing that art can really do for you, and culture. It can bring people together.
One of the things that is probably one of our greatest challenges and opportunities at the center is helping people understand what pluralism is. I think it's not accidental that His Highness focuses on pluralism rather than issues of diversity or inclusion and so forth. And broadly speaking, of course, as Henry, as you know, we really think about pluralism as the conscious and positive actions that individuals and institutions in a society take to positively respond to the diversity that's in their societies, the diversity that's inherent in every society. Where I think that arts and culture are particularly valuable in helping people to understand what pluralism really is in that way is, as you say, it makes it concrete. You can talk about what it means, what it feels to be Syrian and what Syrian culture, what the fabric of cultural understanding is in a specific place, and it helps people to understand what that means in terms of diversity then in a multicultural city like Toronto or elsewhere in the world. And I'm reminded of the opportunity that we had last year to partner on your annual lecture at the Aga Khan Museum with one of our wonderful awardees from the Global Pluralism Award last year, Deborah Ahenkora, who had, of course, won focusing on issues of representation in children's literature and really seeking to boost representation of Africans in children's literature. And for me, that's a really good example of how you make something that may be invisible to many people visible, that representation matters, that understanding the cultural stories of others can help you can help inform your own life and how you interact with others in your society and how you understand others in other societies. So it was such a pleasure to have Deborah deliver the lecture at the museum last year.
Indeed, and it was a great pleasure for us to partner with the GCP because, again, I think that when you look at that intersection, pluralism and the arts, you know, an example like Deborah's is absolutely fabulous because, you know, her advocacy work is so important in bringing that diversity to people outside the country in which it may have been very active. And that's something that, again, I think that arts and culture institutions have a real role to play because we can bring cultures into people's living rooms now that we're doing things digitally, or we can invite people into our institutions to experience it. And they may never have seen this before, in part because, you know, it's not easy for people to encounter cultures outside of their daily lives. Museums are one way of doing it. Travel's another way. But I think museums have a real role in performing arts centers as well in terms of showcasing this diversity. Because that's what we do.
And I think in today's world where division is on the rise, where we're seeing greater difficulty for people to talk across different perspectives and viewpoints, I think one of the things that's particularly valuable about arts and culture is that it offers you a window into some of those issues, into a diverse way of approaching maybe a culture, but maybe also a social issue of the time in a way that can be reflective rather than confrontational, a way that invites you to think about something rather than forcing you into space that will not bring about some kind of mutual common understanding of the differences that you're seeing. And I think that arts and culture can play a really important role in, as you said at the very beginning, dialogue and convening of different people and spaces. I wonder though, Henry, if you maybe want to reflect a little bit on how all of that is happening within COVID. You mentioned the online spaces for the museum, and you know, I'm really struck that I'm sitting here in our beautiful building, which is empty, sadly, today, as you are happily at the museum. Fortunately, you're back open. But this idea also that you have these almost accidental, organic comings together of people from different communities, from different backgrounds and different perspectives. And then they get a chance to collectively experience something through the arts that changes their perspective, that can bring them together. And often those really profound moments can be unplanned in the wonderful nature of wandering into a museum and wandering into an exhibition that you hadn't even planned on seeing, and being offered a new perspective, a new insight onto your life. And of course, with the COVID restrictions, this is much more challenging, but I know you're doing a lot to sort of think about how we might curate some of those discussions online.
Indeed, and I think COVID's very ironic because, you know, during COVID, of course, you're all clustered around your family units. So you've actually now shut down and you're really sequestered. But what's interesting is that maybe because of that, people are actually exploring and they're finding ways to enhance their lives and to give themselves a bit of distraction, points of learning, perhaps entertainment. And one thing that we found certainly in the arts and culture industry is that people have responded to programming that is available online. It's a funny thing because sometimes it takes a crisis to truly allow a form of transmission to truly, you know, take root. But I think as a museum, we've always wanted to take our programs beyond our four walls because, you know, while it's fortuitous and wonderful having people congregate and learn things together, we also realize that actually, in terms of impact, it's important to be able to take these ideas, these showcases, to people well beyond our four walls, well beyond Toronto, because the issues that we're dealing with and the opportunities we have are not Toronto specific. It's not even Canadian specific. It's something that is actually global. And I think that what you've seen during this period of time is a real flourishing of digital programming. And this is very, very positive news, because it means that a small institution like our own can actually have big impact on a global stage, because we can actually showcase the diversity of artistic forms. We can showcase a debate or a discussion such as what we're having today to a much wider audience. And I think that, you know, we're like many other art museums. We're here to display things, but I think that our ethos, which is to explore diversity, explore pluralism, to allow people to open their minds to the possibilities, that's something that is very distinct to us. And the opportunities of doing this digitally actually expand our footprint amazingly. And so we've actually welcomed this. And even though we're open to the public, we carry on our digital programming and are looking at how we blend these two together, because, you know, it's so important for people everywhere to be able to see this material.
And, you know, they say that creativity flourishes in times of constraint. And so I think that we're seeing extraordinary creativity throughout the pandemic. And I know with us at the Global Center, we have found similarly that our online programming has been able to flourish in a really extraordinary way. We were really pleased to be able to launch an online platform for teachers here in Canada on teaching racism issues in the classroom over this summer, and are increasing our online footprint through education and other programming. And I have to say, though, that it is a challenge to bring people together when we all have to opt in on the online space. And I think something that we would really like to see at the center when we think about what's going to happen post-COVID, sort of where do we take all of this creative energy and all of these opportunities, there is a concern that everyone will want to go back to normal because this has been so tough. And when I was working on mediation issues and peacemaking in throughout Africa, one of the things we often saw was that people very quickly revert to status quo after a crisis because there's such a desire to come back to that. And I think one of the things that we really want to see at the center is that these opportunities aren't lost, that we're able to build back better, and that we recognize that diversity is absolutely the strength underpinning our societies. And that's why pluralism is so important. And that's why we can't just say, well, isn't that nice that we're diverse, but that we have to work at this. We have to all collectively say, this is so valuable for our societies, because without it, we won't, it's not just that we won't have nice sort of multicultural festivals or something like that, but that we won't have decent healthcare, we won't have safety for our senior citizens, that we won't have all the things that make a successful and thriving society. So I think we're really hoping also that these kinds of conversations and the commitment that we're seeing come out of the pandemic continues in the longer term around the world. I think there are we all need to guard against in a lot of places. I think that I worry a lot about international cooperation, the failure of international cooperation in all of this. And we've been looking at where alternative sites for international sort of mobilization can come. And I think arts and culture is a really interesting aspect of that. Well, we see deadlock at the UN Security Council, for example. Can you see these amazing collectives of art musicians or artists coming together and talking about what the pandemic means and what post-pandemic societies can look like through the arts? You see that through municipalities, through other social movements. And I think there's actually an enormous amount that can be harnessed there. And I think we're really, really excited to explore that and see where it leads.
Indeed. And I think that, again, as you reflect upon, you know, our experience of COVID over the last 4 months, you know, it truly has, I think, forced people to reassess many, many basic aspects of everyday life. Healthcare suddenly became, you know, and again, healthcare as a primary issue became paramount. We started looking at just the basic notion of the relationship of the state to its citizens. because again, the state stepped up, and in most countries, the state stepped up to help fund and keep people going during this period of time. We've looked at issues, that we may never have looked at before, such as international cooperation and the role of international organizations in helping mobilize this. We saw suddenly how supply chains are fragile, and when everyone's demanding the same thing, respirators and PPE, suddenly the world constricts and it becomes a very difficult thing to fulfill. One thing that I found just amazing, though, is that, with all these issues, which I think consumed people during COVID, arts and culture actually gave people hope. And when you look, for example, in Italy, where you had one of the worst outbreaks initially, and you looked at places like Naples, and people were self-quarantining, they're in a very dense area, all in apartments. But the fact that they opened up their balconies and started to play music together, and this was then repeated in places like Spain, in the UK, even in Toronto, we saw some of the musicians who were part of the symphony orchestras, they'd play from their balconies, they'd play on Zoom. It's amazing how art was actually one of the binding forces for people. Because for as much as you worried about what was happening on the day-to-day, looking at statistics and your eyes welded upon the internet or TV, art and culture gave people something to hope for. And I think that's something that I'm very proud about, because it's where individuals, not just organizations, but individuals use that as their way of expressing themselves and cheering up others. And I think that's, again, one of the great outcomes from what has been a tremendous, an unprecedented crisis worldwide.
And I think it's one of the features of what we hope to see as growing social solidarity. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't just that music was being played, but music was being played to acknowledge and thank the frontline health workers who were underpaid and not necessarily being taken care of in the way that they should have been in some instances. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to focus on in terms of the longer term outcomes of the pandemic is that we've seen the inequality, and then you see this early solidarity. And I think the expressions through arts and culture are one of the strongest examples of this community solidarity, saying we're in this together, even though we're not all experiencing it in the same way. And we're recognizing that, and we're trying to, as you say, give hope and to give comfort. Songs of comfort and other spaces like that have been so powerful. But then how do you help to underpin that to a wider social solidarity that says we've now seen these inequalities. We've been forced to see what the global system has been doing. And we can't look away now. We're responsible to find that longer term solidarity that addresses these issues of inequalities, of marginalization, and so forth. And I think that the arts have enabled, as I was saying before, an expression of that solidarity and of those issues in a way and so it enables people to opt in when they are also, and understandably so, afraid of the difficult conversations to come, because inequality is such a difficult issue to be tackling in a wider society. These are troubling conversations in troubling times that we all need to have. And I think the power of the arts and culture to inspire and uplift, but also to shine a light and essentially hold up a mirror to some of these really, really difficult issues right now is so powerful and really going to be so incredibly important in how we move out of our sort of collective global isolation, and then hopefully into a better time.
Indeed.
I wonder, Henry, if I on that subject of difficult conversations and the power of arts and culture, I'm also really struck that in the midst of this veil being sort of pulled away around inequality in all of our societies around the world, we then saw laid over that, the murder of George Floyd, and then the events that followed both in the US and around the world around systemic racism around the use of police forces and so forth. And it feels like that discussion has then also built upon the understanding of inequalities that arose out of COVID, and has forced us again into a very, very important space to have again a series of very, very difficult conversations in all of our societies. And I'm really struck by how that has evolved in some places around museums, around the questions of what do you memorialize through arts and culture? What do you prioritize? How do you make historical references in a way that includes, and that includes all of these diverse perspectives? How you recognize the bias that may have been inherent in a lot of these spaces. And I'd just be really interested in how you see that, not just now, but how will that continue in the post-COVID moment?
Well, I think, you know, the George Floyd murder has highlighted for museums a real question. It's been a real wake-up call, because I think a lot of museums and other cultural institutions have had to face the question, have we done enough? Is our programming actually reflective of the diversity that lies within not only our societies, but also world culture? And I think that if you look at museums, traditionally they haven't. When you look even at the origins of museums and the origins of types of museums, they've always tended to focus on the Western or the Far Eastern and neglected what happens in the rest of the world. And this is something that, you know, in truth, I mean, museums have been grappling with probably for the last couple of decades. But it's a moment like this that makes museums have to really look into themselves and do a bit of navel gazing and say, why haven't we done enough? Is it because we don't have enough diversity within our workplaces? Is it because, you know, as a museum, we've always focused on one area, but now we have to launch into others? I think that all cultural institutions have had to grapple with this in recent weeks. And if a museum can't say that they've actually been looking at the broader picture, now's the time when they actually have to start doing some shifting and look at how, not just in the immediate time, but in the long term, forever, that they actually do address the diversity issues that they may not have done so before. And it's not just a question of whether a museum has done it, it's a question of why. Why do you do it? And I think the reason you do it is because as public institutions, museums and other cultural institutions are one of a handful of organizations that can actually do this credibly, with authority, with compassion, and also with a sensitive mindset. That's one of the roles that museums do have to play. And that's something which I think this current set of issues has really thrown up into the forefront.
And there's an opportunity to be restorative. And I think it's also important as museums and other institutions undertake these journeys to talk about the reflections that are happening inside institutions in a way that enables everyone to learn from it, because these are all different journeys from different institutions and individuals. And one of the things that is so insidious about systemic racism, as an example, is the fact that it is invisible to those who aren't experiencing it in that way. And so part of these journeys and reflections help to make it visible to those who need to be allies in the journey ahead, right? So to try and really help everyone understand why these perspectives had been marginalized, why certain approaches had been taken, and to really try and unpack that so that people don't just see statue coming down or a monument being changed, but they understand the thinking behind it, and they understand the troubled history that may have gone into that, and what you're trying to do to restore a sense of collective between maybe groups that had been divided, groups that have long-standing historical tensions, and trying to use those as moments, as we were talking about earlier, of connection, of dialogue, and not just saying, well, let's just change what we've done, but really think about why we're changing it and how we're engaging other viewpoints. One of the things we spend a lot of time on in a lot of our work is the notion of unconscious bias, of really questioning ourselves why you assume one thing about one group or individual, or why you hold a particular worldview, so that you yourself can understand that we're all collections of biases. I mean, that's part of just who we all are as people. But if we can be more self-reflective on that, I think we can all be better as we move forward in this.
Absolutely. And again, I think that when you look again at the arts and culture world, you know, we've had to come to face with the unconscious biases that have actually been part of the field from its very beginning. The fact that, you know, there's fine art and then there's ethnography. And they were kept as completely separate things. And one was elevated, the other was kind of put down to a second level. And, you know, that's been there from, you know, the beginnings of the field in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And so I think there's a lot of navel gazing we have to do, and again, navel gazing isn't strong enough. There's a lot of reconciliation we need to do within ourselves intellectually, but also practically. And that's something that I think is very much part and parcel of what museum people have to focus on at this very critical moment in time.
Well, I have to say that thinking about how we understand our own history as towards how we move forward, so many of the amazing art exhibitions that I've been to throughout my life have taught me different perspectives on history through the views of the marginalized, or really trying to say what's missing from this picture. I think, again, to Deborah Ahenkora and her lecture last year, you know, she talks about reading Nancy Drew when she was a little girl and feeling that it was somehow incongruous that she was relating so closely to a blonde girl from upstate New York when she was a young girl in Ghana, and being constantly told you can't be the blonde girl from upstate New York. That was particularly powerful for me because I was the blonde girl from British Columbia and I loved beyond everything. And it was such a reminder that when I was 8, I didn't see what was missing.
Yeah.
Like me. And it's just so powerful now to see so much discussion in the arts and culture communities, and not just in museums, but on television and on the radio, that it's everywhere around us now, to really start to make the invisible visible to all of us, so that we have a collective understanding of the diversity of histories and experiences and perspectives around us. It's incredibly powerful, and I think it touches us in a way that the intellectual doesn't always. That there's something about the heart with arts and culture that is particularly powerful.
Correct. And I think that there's a wonderful opportunity that's at present, which again helps with generational changes. And I think that generation by generation, there is an increased appreciation, understanding, but also practical knowledge of how to actually eradicate systematic discrimination and bias. And there's no question that, you know, with what is going on right now, this younger generation, they embrace it. They truly understand the importance of this. And I think, if anything, it's for older generations to understand how, you know, they have to also reflect upon their own biases. And again, the arts are a wonderful way of exposing this, of being able to showcase the fact that this diversity exists, and also, you know, the exploration of those commonalities. I think it's also very interesting to look at how historically you can see these sort of waves happening from time to time. Where even the whole question about taking down statues, it's nothing new, but it does reflect the fact that whenever you do have these moments of taking down statues, or what we call in the field damnatio memoriae, erasing the past, you know, this is not just censorship. It's actually reflective of changes in societies and changes in societal behaviors and attitudes. And I think that there's no question that we're on one of these inflection points right now. And I look back at all of the other cases that I can remember of the past. It's amazing the changes that can come about. And again, institutions like GCP and the museum, I think we have a tremendous role to play in this. And I'd love to see exhibitions that come out that actually address issues like this. I mean, the whole idea of about colonialism, of inherent bias. Again, this is something that actually, given the nature of our times, would be an amazing exploration, either through exhibitions or through debates and lectures and talks, because again, I think that it will showcase the fact that actually a lot of this has been on the minds of the professionals. It takes a crisis like this for us to actually bring this out into the public and accelerate the pace of discussion and change.
Absolutely, and I think one of the really critical roles that both the museum and the Global Center need to play in this is continuing the conversation. I always worry that in a moment of crisis, we're all talking about Black Lives Matter and racism, but then tomorrow we'll have moved on to something else, and we can't move on. We have to continue to have the difficult conversations and to push forward that kind of understanding around the power of pluralism, the power of coming together, and the power of seeing these extraordinary differences around us. I just sort of thinking as a final reflection on your comment about the younger generation. My son the other day said to me, he said, "Mommy, I don't think I want to live in North America when I'm older, because Black people get bullied here, and that's right. And so I want to go somewhere else, and I want to go back to Kenya." And I said, you know, people are being bullied in Kenya as well for a whole bunch of other reasons, sometimes the color of their skin, but a whole bunch of other reasons as well. And you can't get away from it. You can't look away. And what your job is to be an ally and to help make that change. And I think that these issues are, as you were saying before, around our own dinner tables today, having a very powerful effect, and one that I really hope is lasting. I have a feeling that there's a lot of work that the museum and the Global Center can be doing together, to say, on both exhibitions and dialogues around these issues in the months and years to come.
Absolutely, and I think that the sort of partnership between the two in this regard can be very powerful, because it's inherent in our DNA of both organizations to look at these issues, but from different lenses. Actually, let's bring them together, and there's a real opportunity for being able to showcase it through the tangible.
You know, I have to say that in the world of physical and social distancing, it's so nice to spend a bit of quality Zoom time discussing all of these things with you, and I'm really inspired by the possibilities, and particularly about some of the joint tasks that we have ahead of us today. So thanks again, Henry.
I couldn't agree more, and again, thank you very much, because I think, again, we've touched upon many of these issues as they relate to both JCP and the museum, and I do believe that jointly there's programming that we can actually do together that addresses all of these issues. So thank you very much, and again, thanks for the time.
We'll see you soon.